Every ambassador who entered her presence chamber at Whitehall described the same image: white as marble, lips stained blood red, a flame-red wig rising above a rough collar so perfectly pressed it might have been cut from paper. They were describing the most recognizable face in the Western world, a woman who seemed less like a person and more like a living argument that some human beings simply existed outside the reach of time. Now look closer. Beneath the powder, the skin is pitted with scars she spent 30 years trying to bury. Behind those sealed lips, something has been going wrong for years. A smell, a blackness, a deterioration that foreign diplomats recorded in their private dispatches with barely concealed horror. Elizabeth I reigned for 45 years over what poets called the Golden Age. She controlled every portrait. She ordered unflattering likenesses destroyed, and the tools she used to look immortal were quietly killing her. To understand what was happening inside Elizabeth's mouth, you first need to understand what sugar meant to the people of Tudor England. Because it was not a food, it was a declaration. Sugar had reached Europe through the Crusades, filtering slowly westward across centuries of trade routes and colonial expansion, until, by the 16th century, it had arrived on English tables in significant quantities for the first time. Significant, that is, if you could afford it. Contemporary sources compared refined sugar to pearls and exotic spices. It was weighed, traded, and hoarded like a commodity of genuine material value, because that is exactly what it was. The further up the social hierarchy you sat, the more sugar you consumed. The more sugar you consumed, the higher your status appeared. The logic was circular and, for Elizabeth, absolute. She loved it without reservation. Sweetmeats, candied violets, marzipan, sugared fruits, desserts soaked through with syrup. These were not occasional indulgences. They were documented features of her daily life. Pleasures she considered entirely appropriate to her rank, which was the highest rank available on English soil. Nobody told her to stop. Nobody connected the sweetness in her mouth to what was quietly happening to her teeth, because nobody yet understood that connection existed. Dental decay was understood as misfortune, the way a broken bone might be understood as misfortune. Something that happened to you, not something you caused yourself, one candied violet at a time. She did attempt to care for her teeth, that much the historical record confirms. She used tooth cloths, small pieces of cloth moistened with a mixture of white wine, vinegar, and honey, and rubbed across the teeth to clean them. She received toothpicks as formal gifts, a common practice among the Tudor elite. Her physicians were aware that something was wrong with her breath and offered their most considered medical advice in response. Eat more sweetened things, they told her, to sweeten the smell. Read that again slowly. The remedy her doctors prescribed for the damage caused by sugar was more sugar. The loop closed on itself with an almost elegant completeness. More sweetness to mask the evidence of sweetness. More acid from the vinegar and wine to scrub away the stains that acid had helped create in the first place. Tudor physicians were not negligent men. They were working at the edge of everything their era understood about the human body. And what their era understood was catastrophically incomplete. They were trying to help. With every application, they accelerated the damage. By 1597, the results were visible enough to enter the diplomatic record by name. André Hurault, Sieur de Mace, the French ambassador, attended a private audience with the Queen of England that year, and afterward recorded what he observed in his personal journal. Her face, he wrote, was very aged, long and thin. Her teeth were very yellow and unequal. On the left side, he noted carefully, there were fewer than on the right. He was being diplomatic. The German traveler Paul Hentzner, visiting the English court at roughly the same period, was less restrained. He described her teeth as black, and added an observation that would echo through historical writing for centuries afterward. This, he remarked, appeared to be a defect the English were particularly prone to, owing to their heavy consumption of sugar. He was not wrong about the national pattern. But the Queen had said it. By her 60s, the deterioration had reached a point she could no longer fully conceal in public. Before receiving important visitors, she reportedly stuffed scented cloth into her mouth to muffle the smell of her decaying teeth. For formal appearances, she packed the hollows of her cheeks with cotton wadding to reconstruct the fuller face that still appeared in her official portraits. The face that painters had been instructed to reproduce from approved younger likenesses. The face that was, by this point, a work of historical fiction. Here is the detail that requires a moment of stillness to fully absorb. The English peasants, who could not afford sugar, ate rough bread, vegetables, and whatever grain-based foods their circumstances allowed. Their teeth, by direct comparison with the documentary and skeletal evidence, were considerably healthier than those of the people who ate at the Queen's table. The rotting black mouth was not a marker of poverty. It was a marker of wealth. It was what success looked like from the inside of the jaw, and Elizabeth's court took note. When the most powerful woman in England displayed blackened teeth became the aesthetic. Courtiers whose diet had not yet produced the fashionable darkness used soot and charcoal to replicate the look artificially. The queen was rotting from the inside out, and the nobility of England was reaching for the charcoal to keep up. She refused to allow her teeth to be extracted. The historical record is consistent on this point. Elizabeth had a genuine and documented terror of pain, and the extraction methods available in the 16th century were, by any reasonable measure, worth being terrified of. At some point, a courtier reportedly volunteered to have one of his own teeth pulled in front of her, in her presence, as a demonstration that the procedure was survivable. Whether this persuaded her or not, the teeth remained. The decay continued, and the scented cloth went back into her mouth before the next audience. The mouth was only the beginning. In October of 1562, Elizabeth fell gravely ill at Hampton Court. Within days, she was too weak to speak. Her counselors, the men who managed the machinery of English government, began moving quietly toward the question they were not supposed to ask out loud. Who comes next? The disease that had taken hold of her was smallpox, which at the time killed roughly 30% of the people it reached. She was 29 years old and had been queen for 4 years. She survived. But survival in this case arrived with a permanent cost. The smallpox left pitted scars across her face that would never fully smooth away, marks she would spend the remaining 4 decades of her reign working to erase, cover, and deny. It was in the aftermath of that illness, in the specific psychological aftermath of having nearly died and woken up changed, that she turned to the substance that would quietly define the rest of her life. Venetian ceruse was the most sought-after cosmetic in 16th century Europe. A paste made from white lead, vinegar, and water, it dried to a smooth porcelain finish capable of covering blemishes, scars, and the advancing evidence of age with equal and apparently effortless efficiency. It was favored across the European aristocracy for reasons that made complete cultural sense at the time. Pale white skin was a marker of nobility. It signaled that you did not labor under the open sky, that your hands had never turned soil, that the sun had never had occasion to reach you. The whiter the skin, the higher the implied station. Venetian ceruse delivered that whiteness more completely than anything else available, and Elizabeth applied it every morning to her face and neck, every morning for nearly 4 decades. Her ladies applied it fresh each day. Sometimes the same application remained on her skin for up to a week before it was removed. And when it was removed, the cleanser used was a preparation of eggshells, alum, and mercury. Lead going on in the morning, mercury coming off at the end of the week. Day after day, year after year, for the better part of 4 decades, while she held court, granted audiences, signed legislation, and received the ambassadors who described her as a living monument. What lead does to human skin over time is not complicated. It corrodes it. It damages the very surface it is applied to, creating the blemishes and discoloration it was meant to conceal. Which meant that as the ceruse gradually destroyed the condition of Elizabeth's skin, it produced new imperfections that required coverage. The response was more ceruse, thicker layers, a heavier application over a more damaged surface, which caused further damage, which required further coverage. By the final years of her reign, contemporary accounts describe her wearing makeup reportedly an inch thick. The mask had become structural. It was no longer decoration applied over a face. It was the face. Remove it, and what remained beneath was something the portraits had never shown, and the court was never meant to see. Her lip color came from cinnabar, a pigment ground from raw mercury ore. Applied to the lips, it was absorbed through the soft tissue of her mouth throughout every hour she wore it. Mercury poisoning is not a subtle process. It produces, over time and with accumulating exposure, memory loss, increasing irritability, episodes of depression, and in advanced cases, trembling of the hands. All of these conditions were documented in Elizabeth during the last years of her reign. Her moods grew more volatile. Her memory became unreliable. Her physical decline accelerated in ways her court attributed to age and grief, which were not entirely wrong explanations, but were not the complete ones. She banned mirrors from her private rooms. This detail appears across multiple sources and carries more weight than it might initially seem. By the end, she had spent so many years managing the image, controlling the portraits, approving the likenesses, that the gap between the icon and the woman inside it had grown beyond what any mirror could have been allowed to confirm. She refused to be examined by her physicians. She refused to be seen in natural light. She kept a servant whose sole function was to tend to certain parts of her body in complete privacy, so that no one outside that arrangement ever saw what the lead and mercury had done to her skin beneath the clothing. She also controlled the painted record with the same precision she applied to everything else. Royal painters were required to work from approved face patterns, template likenesses derived from earlier, younger portraits. No matter how many years passed, the official Elizabeth remained the same, ageless on canvas, unchanged in the engravings distributed across the kingdom. The real aging, the real damage, the real cost of 4 decades of lead and mercury applied daily to living skin existed only in the private dispatches of foreign diplomats and the careful silences of the people closest to her. Venetian Cerusse was officially reclassified as a poison 31 years after her death. 31 years. The science caught up eventually, as it always does, with a precision that serves no one who needed it. Elizabeth had already paid the full price of that delay, in scars and trembling hands and a face she could not allow anyone, including herself, to look at directly. The smallpox had given her the first scar. Everything after that she had done herself, one careful morning application at a time. Here is where the story requires a correction, because the version of Elizabeth you have probably encountered before gets this part wrong in a way that matters. The popular image of the Tudor court is one of spectacular filth. Unwashed bodies, unchanged clothes, rooms that smelled like the inside of a barn, monarchs who bathed once a year if the calendar cooperated. And while there is genuine grimness in the Tudor relationship with hygiene, the specific claim that Elizabeth and her contemporaries simply avoided washing out of laziness or ignorance misreads the situation entirely. The people who bathed least in 16th century England were not the careless ones. In many cases, they were following the most current medical advice available to them. In 1539, the physician Thomas Moulton published a health manual that circulated widely among the literate classes of Tudor England. His warning on the subject of bathing was direct and urgent. Hot water, he wrote, opened the pores of the skin, and through those open pores entered miasma, the bad air, the invisible contaminated vapor that Tudor medicine held responsible for plague, fever, sweating sickness, and the full catalogue of epidemic disease that moved through England with reliable and devastating frequency. To strip off your clothing and lower yourself into a hot bath was not, by the logic Moulton was articulating, an act of cleanliness. It was an act of exposure. You were opening your body's defenses at the precise moment you most needed them sealed. This was not one physician's eccentric opinion. It was the medical consensus of the 16th century, shared by practitioners across England and the continent, grounded in a coherent theoretical framework that simply happened to be wrong. The miasma model of disease transmission was internally consistent, widely taught, and catastrophically incomplete. Everyone operating within it, from the court physicians attending Elizabeth to the village healers treating peasants in the countryside, was working in good faith from the same flawed map. Tudor royal palaces were not primitive structures without sanitary infrastructure. They had bathrooms. They had sophisticated piped water systems capable of delivering both hot and cold running water. They had steam rooms. They had bathing facilities scented with herbs and prepared for royal use. The technology for bathings existed and functioned. What made bathing a measured and infrequent act rather than a daily routine was not the absence of facilities. It was the fear of what opening the pores might let in. So how did the Tudor court stay clean, by their own definition of the word? Through linen. The white linen undergarment, the shift worn directly against the skin, was the workhorse of Tudor hygiene in exactly the way that daily bathing functions today. These shifts were designed to absorb the sweat, oils, and impurities that the skin produced, drawing them away from the body and into the fabric. Court, they were changed daily, sometimes more frequently than that. They were washed with soap and water, inspected, and returned clean. The logic was considered not just adequate but medically sound. Washing the cloth that touched the body was safer than washing the body itself, because the cloth could be cleaned without opening the pores to whatever was moving through the air. The historian Ruth Goodman tested this method directly, wearing period-accurate linen shifts and changing them with the frequency a Tudor court attendant would have managed, and found that the approach controlled body odor effectively, in some conditions more effectively than bathing, without the discipline of clean linen afterward. By the standards of what Tudor medicine understood and Tudor practice demanded, a woman who changed her linen shifts daily and used rosewater and herbal preparations on her skin was a clean woman. By those standards, Elizabeth was clean. There is a line attributed to her that has circulated for centuries: "I bathe once a month, whether I need it or not." It appears regularly in accounts of Tudor hygiene as evidence of royal filth, quoted with a mixture of amusement and revulsion. The problem is that no reliable contemporary source confirms she actually said it. It reads more like the kind of remark that gets attached to famous figures after the fact, compressed and sharpened by retelling until it sounds exactly like what someone from that era would have said. Whether she said it or not, the sentiment it conveys is real. Monthly bathing, or something close to it, was considered entirely reasonable by Tudor standards, not a confession of neglect, but a statement of normal practice. What a real bath actually required is worth understanding, because it reframes what bathing meant as a decision. There was no plumbing connected to the living quarters of a Tudor palace. A bath meant sending for a large wooden tub, which had to be carried to the appropriate room. It meant heating water, which required multiple fires, multiple containers, and the sustained labor of multiple servants carrying buckets of hot water through corridors. The preparation alone could occupy several attendants for hours. The event was logistically closer to a ceremony than to a daily habit, which is why it was treated with the weight and planning of a ceremony rather than the casual regularity of washing your face. By Tudor standards, she was clean. She changed her linen. She used herbal preparations on her skin. She smelled of rosewater and lavender rather than unwashed skin, because the linen system, combined with the perfumed preparations her ladies applied, genuinely managed what it was designed to manage. What it could not manage was the lead, or the mercury, or the sugar. Those were operating on a different schedule entirely. What Elizabeth built in place of washing was not neglect. It was architecture. Every element of her daily sensory presentation had been designed, selected, and layered with the same deliberate calculation she applied to her portraits and her political speeches. The perfume was not incidental to the performance of being Elizabeth. It was load-bearing. It held the image up from a different angle than the ceruse did, working on the nose rather than the eye, constructing a version of her that existed in the room before she entered it and lingered after she left. Scent was a political instrument, and she used it with the precision of someone who understood exactly what was at stake if the instrument failed. Her ladies-in-waiting prepared the materials in the palace still rooms, small workrooms dedicated to the production of medicinal and cosmetic preparations. Rosewater was among the most common outputs of these rooms, distilled from petals and applied to the skin with soft cloths, not for cleaning in any meaningful biological sense, but for the controlled replacement of one smell with another. Lavender oil, vinegar infusions, herbal mixtures brewed to specifications developed over years of royal use. These were dabbed onto her wrists, behind her ears, along the neck, at the specific points where the body's own heat would carry the scent outward into the surrounding air. The result was not cleanliness, it was a curated atmosphere, a woman-shaped environment that smelled of flowers and herbs, and the considered choices of a sovereign who had decided that this was what power smelled like. She also carried pomanders. A pomander was a small, ornate container, often made of gold or silver, and designed to be worn on a chain at the belt or carried in the hand, filled with a compressed mixture of aromatic resins, herbs, and spices. Ambergris, cloves, musk, labdanum. The combinations varied by maker and by fashion, but the function was consistent. Whenever an unwanted smell entered her immediate vicinity, the pomander came up. It was raised to the nose with a gesture that was entirely natural and entirely deliberate at the same time, an instinctive reach for clean air that also happened to broadcast, to every person in the room watching it happen, a very specific message. The message was this: I am not subject to the same conditions as you. The smell that reaches you does not reach me, because I have ensured it cannot. I exist within a different set of rules, and this small gold object in my hand is the proof. She had a scented walking stick made for use in her later years, a staff she could raise to her face when passing through corridors occupied by courtiers whose bodies made the inevitable demands that bodies make. The gesture was the same as the pomander, scaled up for visibility, a public declaration, performed in motion, that the queen moved through the world differently than the world moved through itself. Her gloves were perfumed. This was not unusual among the Tudor elite, but Elizabeth treated scented gloves as a gift with genuine political weight, distributing them to courtiers and foreign dignitaries as tokens of royal favor. The scent embedded in the leather was not her body's scent. It was her chosen scent, manufactured and applied by her ladies and presented as an extension of the royal person. She gave people the smell she had decided to have, not the smell she had. The distinction mattered enormously to her. Her handkerchiefs were soaked in oils. Her dresses, those extraordinary constructions of silk and velvet and embroidered fabric that required their own staff to manage, were layered and structured in ways that covered the body and held scent within their folds. The clothing was both a visual monument and an olfactory one, carrying the prepared fragrance of the still room wherever it went. Her hair, in the years when it was still her own hair, was rarely washed. Instead, it was stiffened with preparations of sugar water and egg whites, then powdered, a process that managed its appearance at the cost of its cleanliness. As the years of lead and mercury exposure accumulated and her hair began to thin and fall, she transitioned to wigs. The flame-red auburn wig that every ambassador described in their dispatches was not a fashion choice made once and maintained out of habit. It was a controlled image decision, a manufactured consistency that ensured the icon in the portraits matched the figure in the presence chamber regardless of what was happening to the head beneath it. And beneath everything, the palace floors. Rushes were spread across the floors of Tudor palace rooms and soaked in scented oils, a standard practice designed to trap dirt and manage the smell of a building occupied continuously by hundreds of people and their attendant waste. The rushes did trap the dirt. They also trapped everything else: the food scraps, the hair, the accumulated organic residue of daily court life, building up in layers beneath the fresh surface, covering until the rot underneath became a permanent background condition that no amount of lavender oil distributed across the top could fully address. The palace smelled like a garden from above. From below, it was something else entirely. Elizabeth moved through it wrapped in rosewater and pomander smoke, a woman-shaped weather system of controlled fragrance, and the court received her exactly as she intended. Not as a body subject to the ordinary conditions of a body, as something cleaner than that. As something that had, through sheer force of will and an extraordinary quantity of aromatic resin, arranged itself above the common fate. The smell said she had, the lead said otherwise. Pull back from the Queen for a moment, and look at the building she lived in. From the outside, the Tudor royal palaces were monuments to the organizing principle that power should be visible. Whitehall, Hampton Court, Richmond. Massive stone structures, gilded ceilings, great halls hung with tapestries depicting the full catalogue of English glory. Velvet everywhere, candlelight on polished surfaces, music moving through corridors lined with liveried servants, standing at attention. The architecture of these buildings was designed to produce a specific and overwhelming impression, and it produced it reliably on every foreign dignitary who passed through the gates. Walk further in, past the presence chamber, past the privy chamber, past the layers of access that Tudor court protocol used to organize proximity to the sovereign. Keep walking until you reach the parts of the palace that the tapestries were not covering and the candlelight was not reaching. There were no flushing toilets. There was no sewage system connected to the building in any modern sense. There was no plumbing servicing the private living quarters where the Queen and her court spent the hours that were not devoted to ceremony. What there was, for everyone from the highest nobleman to the lowest household servant, was a chamber pot, a ceramic vessel kept in the room and used as the situation required, then emptied by whoever in the household hierarchy was responsible for emptying it, which was not the person who had used it. For the Queen herself, the arrangement was more elaborate and considerably stranger. Elizabeth's most private toilet was a close stool. From the outside it looked like a piece of furniture, a cushioned wooden chair with a hinged seat, upholstered in materials appropriate to the royal apartments it occupied. Beneath the cushion was a ceramic pot. The close stool was emptied multiple times daily, cleaned and perfumed, a cycle of maintenance that required dedicated attendance. And the person responsible for that attendance was not a servant in any ordinary sense of the word. The groom of the stool was a titled position, held by a member of the nobility. The holder of this office was selected for loyalty, discretion, and the specific quality of trustworthiness that the Tudor court demanded from anyone permitted to be physically present with the monarch during her most private and unguarded moments. This was not a humiliating assignment. It was one of the most politically significant positions in the entire court structure, for a reason that seems counterintuitive until you think about it carefully. Physical proximity to the Queen's body during her most private moments meant sustained access to the Queen herself, unmediated by ceremony, protocol, or the performed version of Elizabeth that the rest of the court encountered. The conversations that happened in the privy chamber while the close stool was being attended were not public conversations. They were private ones, conducted between a sovereign and a person she had decided to trust with the most intimate details of her physical existence. That trust translated directly into political influence. The groom of the stool knew things, was told things, was present for things. In the Tudor court, where proximity to power was power, there was no closer proximity available. Beyond the close stool, the waste management infrastructure of the palace operated on a system that functioned, in the loosest sense of the word, but never without consequence. Chamber pots used by the broader court household were emptied into cesspits, large brick-lined underground chambers positioned beneath the palace or immediately outside it, designed to collect accumulated waste until they required clearing. The men who cleared them were called gong farmers, or sometimes night soil men, and they worked exclusively after dark. They moved through the palace corridors and service passages carrying buckets and larger vessels, navigating the building by candlelight, transporting the collected waste of hundreds of people through the same spaces those people had occupied during the day. The smell that this process generated was not a minor inconvenience. It was a permanent atmospheric condition, a baseline presence in the life of the palace that all the lavender and rosemary and sweet marjoram burned indoors could reduce but never eliminate. The floor rushes helped, in theory. Fresh rushes spread across the floors and soaked in scented oils were standard practice in Tudor domestic spaces at every level of the social hierarchy, from royal palaces to middling households. They absorbed spills, trapped dirt, and carried whatever fragrance had been worked into them. What they also did inevitably was accumulate. The fresh layer went on top. The previous layer remained beneath it. The organic material trapped in the lower layers, the food scraps and hair, and biological residue of continuous habitation, decomposed slowly under the fresh covering, creating a hidden stratum of rot beneath the scented surface that visitors would not have seen and could not entirely avoid smelling. The court moved. This is the detail that reframes the geography of Tudor royal life. Elizabeth did not remain in a single palace. She moved her entire court, hundreds of people with all their attendant furniture, clothing, paperwork, and household requirements, from one royal residence to another on a rotating basis throughout the year. The political and ceremonial reasons for this movement were real and various, but so was the practical one. The longer a palace had been continuously occupied, the worse the accumulated waste problem became, and at a certain point the only fully effective solution to the smell was to leave the building behind, allow it to be cleaned and aired in the court's absence, and not return until the cycle had reset. Elizabeth was not fleeing her palaces. She was managing them the way you manage any system that produces more waste than it can process in place. She moved, and the smell faded, and eventually she came back, until it was time to move again. None of what Elizabeth did to her body makes complete sense until you understand what she had watched happen to another woman's body before her own life had properly begun. Anne Boleyn was arrested in May of 1536. Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old. She would not have understood what was happening in any adult sense of the word, and the specifics of her mother's fallen execution would have reached her later. Assembled from fragments over years of court life, whispered histories, and the careful silences of people who had been present and survived by saying very little afterward, what she would have absorbed, gradually and completely, was the essential structure of what had occurred. A woman at the Tudor court had been powerful. Then she had been vulnerable. Then she had been gone. Anne Boleyn had not been destroyed by an enemy from outside the court. She had been destroyed from within it, by the machinery of a system that had elevated her, and then, when the calculation changed, had dismantled her with the same efficiency. The specific accusations against her, the process by which she moved from queen to prisoner to executed woman in the space of weeks, the speed and completeness of her erasure from the official record, all of it pointed toward a single lesson that Elizabeth spent the rest of her life absorbing and acting on. A female body that showed weakness invited destruction. This was not a neurotic fear or an irrational one. It was a conclusion drawn from direct evidence by a woman with one of the sharpest political minds of her century. In the world Elizabeth governed, the body of a female ruler was not her private property. It was a public object, scrutinized by every ambassador, every counselor, every foreign king weighing whether England under a woman was England worth respecting, fearing, or attempting to control. Every gray hair was evidence, every sunken cheek was data. Every visible sign of aging was a signal to the men around her that the calculation might be shifting, that the moment they had been waiting for might be approaching, that the time to move was getting closer. She had watched what happened when a woman at the center of English power became, in the eyes of the court, a liability rather than an asset. She had no intention of becoming that, so she built Gloriana. The name came from Edmund Spenser's epic poem, but the concept was entirely her own construction. An ageless sovereign, a virgin queen standing outside the ordinary conditions of female existence, exempt from the vulnerability of marriage, the physical demands of childbirth, the visible evidence of time. The portraits maintained the fiction on canvas. The decrees ensured it circulated. The band mirrors kept it intact in the room where she actually lived. The lead and mercury sustained it on her face. Every element of the apparatus she had constructed served the same fundamental purpose, which was to prevent anyone from seeing clearly what was happening to the woman inside it. She refused to be examined by her physicians. This appears across multiple sources as a consistent feature of her later years, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. She had access to the best medical practitioners available in Tudor England. She had every practical reason to submit to examination, particularly as the symptoms of what the lead and mercury were doing to her body became harder to ignore. She refused anyway, because an examination was an admission. It was a formal acknowledgement that the body existed, that it was subject to the ordinary conditions of bodies, that it was aging and deteriorating and would eventually fail. Any one of those acknowledgments, made visible within the court's relentless observation apparatus, was a crack in the image, and the image could not afford cracks. She had mirrors removed from her private rooms. She arranged her schedule to avoid natural light when her face could not be fully managed. She stood for hours at public appearances rather than sit, not because standing was comfortable, which by her later years it was not, but because sitting looked like fatigue, and fatigue looked like weakness, and weakness was the one thing she had spent her entire adult life refusing to display. The servant whose only function was to tend to certain aspects of her body in complete private was not an extravagance. It was a security measure. The fewer people who saw the real condition of her skin, her hair, her face without the mask, the fewer people who could carry that information outward into the court, where information was currency and weakness was the most valuable kind. Here is what all of this cost, understood plainly. She chose the mask over her health. Not once, in a single dramatic moment of decision, but thousands of times, in the small daily choices that accumulated over 4 decades into a system that was quietly destroying her. She chose the ceruse over her skin. She chose the cinnabar over her mouth. She chose the sealed rooms and the banned mirrors over any honest accounting of what was happening to her body. She made these choices with the full rational weight of her intelligence behind them, because she had calculated correctly that for a woman on England's throne in the 16th century, the image was not vanity, it was survival. The tragedy is not that she was vain. The tragedy is that she was right. And the tools of her survival were eating her alive from the inside out, one careful morning at a time. And there was nothing in her world that could have told her so, in terms she was able to afford to believe. By the winter of 1603, the apparatus was failing. Not visibly, not yet, not in any way the court could officially acknowledge, or the diplomatic dispatches could record without careful management of language. But the women who had known her longest, the ladies who had been with her since before she was queen, the ones who had dressed her and washed her linen and known her face without the ceruse and sat with her through the long private hours that the public record never captured, those women were dying. One by one, across the final years of her reign, the people who had held the private version of her were leaving. And with each one who went, something in Elizabeth's relationship to her own continuation shifted it in a direction that no physician and no courtier and no careful management of mirrors and portraits could reverse. Catherine Howard, Countess of Nottingham, had been one of her closest companions. A woman who had served her for decades, who understood the specific weight of what it meant to be trusted with the real face behind the constructed one. When Catherine died in February of 1603, the accounts of Elizabeth's behavior in the weeks that followed described something that had moved beyond grief in the ordinary sense into a dissolution of the organizing will that had held everything together for 45 years. She stopped eating. The reports are consistent across multiple sources. She refused food. She refused sleep. She refused to see her physicians. She refused to be bathed and washed. She refused to allow the doctors who attended her to examine her properly, which was consistent with the pattern of her final years, but had reached by this point a completeness that was no longer strategic. It was something else. The refusals were no longer about managing the image. They were about something that had gone quieter and more absolute than image management. For weeks, those who attended her at Richmond Palace described her standing in her apartments, not sitting, standing, sometimes for hours at a stretch, silent and largely motionless, staring at nothing in particular. The accounts note that she seemed reluctant to sit, reportedly afraid that if she allowed herself to rest, she would not be able to rise again. Whether this was a rational assessment of her physical condition or something less literal, the result was the same. She stood, hours passed, she continued standing. The court moved around her carefully, the way you move around something that is both very fragile and very dangerous to disturb. She was reportedly plagued during this period by visions of her own body, a ghostly double, frail and aged, that she kept seeing in the rooms around her. The accounts of this are difficult to interpret cleanly across the distance of 4 centuries, and it would be careless to draw firm conclusions about what exactly she was experiencing. What the accounts agree on is that she was seeing something the people around her could not see, and that what she was seeing was herself, diminished, and that she could not stop. Consider what she had built and maintained for 45 years. Every portrait approved, every unflattering likeness ordered, destroyed, every mirror removed from the private rooms, every painter required to work from the young face, the official face, the face that had been decided upon and frozen in the approved record, regardless of what time was doing to the original. She had constructed one of the most complete and sustained image management operations in English history, and she had done it with the specific purpose of ensuring that no one, including herself, ever had to confront the gap between Gloriana and the woman underneath her. And now, in the apartments at Richmond, with Catherine gone and the food refused, and the physicians kept at a distance, the gap had apparently become impossible to manage from the inside. She died on the 24th of March, 1603. She was 69 years old. 69 was a remarkable age for the era, made more remarkable by the specific catalogue of what her body had quietly processed across the decades. Most medical historians point to pneumonia as the likely immediate cause of her death, a respiratory infection taking hold in a body whose reserves had been running low for years. Cumulative lead and mercury poisoning are widely considered contributing factors by historians of Tudor medicine. The long-term damage to her organs and nervous system, creating the conditions in which a respiratory illness could become fatal rather than survivable. She had survived smallpox at 29. She had governed for 45 years over a court that would have dismantled her at the first clear sign of weakness. She had managed her image, her physicians, her painters, her mirrors, and her own reflection with a consistency and intelligence that no male contemporary was ever required to match, because no male contemporary was ever required to justify his right to hold power through the uninterrupted maintenance of a physical appearance. The lead had been going on every morning for nearly 4 decades. The mercury had been coming off at the end of every week. The cinnabar had been sitting against the soft tissue of her mouth, through every audience, every council meeting, every state occasion for which the full face was required. Venetian ceruse was officially reclassified as a poison 31 years after her death. The science arrived on its own schedule, as it always does, with a thoroughness that serves no one who already paid the price of the delay. Elizabeth had been dead for 3 decades by the time the law caught up with what her body had known for 40 years. The mask had outlasted the woman. It always does. Go back to the presence chamber at Whitehall. Look at her one more time. The white is lead, the red is mercury. The wig covers hair that fell out in the hands of a servant sworn to silence. The packed cheeks hide the hollows underneath. The sealed lips muffle 40 years of decay that her physicians made worse with every remedy they prescribed. The pomander rising to her nose is not elegance. It is infrastructure. She did not fall apart from ignorance or carelessness. She fell apart because the tools she used to appear invulnerable were eating her alive, and she understood the cost clearly enough to keep paying it anyway. Because for a woman holding England together by the force of an image, there was no alternative currency. This is what a golden age looks like from the inside. If this changed how you see history, the next video will do it again.